This isn't just about motorcycles, it's about what happens when an American legend gets ambushed in broad daylight. Harley-Davidson's pride, its very identity, is under attack. But the shocking turn at the end? That's the part you need to know. What's happening? For over a century, Harley-Davidson had been synonymous with American grit, chrome thunder, and the open road. Its brand was as much about identity as machinery. The eagle on the tank, the roar that could rattle windows, and the pride of knowing you were riding something built in Milwaukee, not imported from afar. But when Honda's Rebel 500 began sweeping into the American market, it did more than challenge Harley. It pierced a cultural heart. It was not simply another motorcycle arriving at dealerships, it was a direct invasion into Harley's sacred space, a move that carried the sting of betrayal. One longtime rider put it bluntly, "I always thought my first bike would be a Harley, but when I saw the price tag, I knew it wasn't for me. The Rebel gave me freedom without the debt, and that felt like real rebellion." What made it sting was not just Honda's audacity, but the timing. At a moment when American manufacturing was already fragile, Honda struck with a machine that was light, sleek, and unapologetically aimed at Harley's base. Harley had survived wars, oil crises, and even near bankruptcy, but it always leaned on one story, that it was America's motorcycle. Now, Honda wasn't just presenting a new bike, it was telling riders they no longer needed Harley to feel rebellious. And that suggestion hit like a knife through Harley's heritage. For riders who had spent decades wearing Harley patches, the betrayal felt deeply personal. It was not about an engine specification or a sales figure. It was about trust, loyalty, and the unspoken contract between a brand and its people. Honda's bold move fractured that contract, and the first cracks began to show not in factories or on Wall Street, but in the hearts of the riders themselves. But the blow to heritage was only the beginning, because Honda had more than symbolism in its arsenal. Design war. The Honda Rebel 500 rolled out with a design so stripped down, so unapologetically modern, that it made Harley's cruisers look bloated by comparison. Where Harley leaned on chrome and bulk, Honda delivered minimalism and agility. The Rebel's low seats, slim lines, and matte finishes screamed rebellion, not from the 1970s, but from tomorrow. It was a visual declaration that the new generation of riders didn't want their father's motorcycles. They wanted something they could own without feeling tied to an outdated past. For decades, Harley's aesthetic had been its shield. No matter how performance shifted, the heavy, loud silhouette reassured its riders that they were part of a tradition stretching back to the 1900s. But that very reliance on the old look had hardened into a weakness. The Rebel turned that weakness into a spotlight. Younger riders didn't want chrome shining like a jukebox, they wanted black steel that looked like it belonged on city streets as much as on highways. Honda captured that mood and Harley suddenly seemed locked in amber. The generational clash became visible at bike rallies where Rebels and Harleys parked side by side. The Harley still looked imposing, but next to the sleek lines of the Rebel it seemed oversized, almost desperate to hold attention. Riders who once scoffed at Japanese imports now felt uneasy watching teenagers and 20-somethings line up to test ride the Rebel, snapping selfies and posting them online. The design war was not just a battle of bikes, it was a battle of time itself. And design was only the second strike, because Honda's most devastating weapon was still waiting to be revealed. What do you think? Is Honda redefining rebellion, or is Harley still the king of the road? Drop a like if you're feeling this battle, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Price shock. The Rebel 500 hit American showrooms at around $7,000. For many, that was the price of possibility, a motorcycle you could actually afford without draining your savings or taking out a brutal loan. Harley, on the other hand, was still pushing bikes that stretched well into $15,000 or more. The comparison was not simply numbers on a price tag, it was a cultural earthquake. In an era when wages were stagnant and inflation squeezed every paycheck, Honda had given people a way in while Harley had slammed the door. Price is not supposed to define rebellion, but in this case it did. A Harley that cost as much as a small car no longer looked like freedom. It looked like debt. The Rebel, with its accessible sticker, whispered a different story. that rebellion could be democratic, that anyone could buy into the movement. Harley had always painted itself as the brand of the working man, but when the working man saw he needed nearly double the money just to start the engine, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. One longtime Harley owner said, "I rode Harleys for 20 years, patched up with the Brotherhood, went to Sturgis every summer. But when the price of the new models climbed higher than my truck payment, I had to step back. My kid bought a Rebel 500, and for the first time I realized maybe freedom didn't have to cost so much." The fury spread quickly. Forums and social media lit up with bitter comparisons. Riders accused Harley of forgetting its roots, of chasing luxury markets while ignoring the everyday rider who once built its empire. Honda, meanwhile, looked like the people's champion, offering a motorcycle that felt designed not for Wall Street bankers, but for the warehouse worker, the teacher, the delivery driver. It was not just a price war. It was a moral war over who really stood for the rider. And as the numbers tore loyalty apart, the human reaction would prove even more explosive. Don't waste cash on overpriced dealer gear. We've prepared a list of top-quality helmets, gloves, and luggage that give you more for less. Grab them in the description below. The riders react. For years, Harley-Davidson rallies had been more than gatherings. They were pilgrimages. But when Honda's Rebel 500 began to appear in parking lots alongside Harley's, the tension was electric. The old guard felt insulted, as if the presence of the Rebel was a challenge to everything they had built. They spoke of betrayal, of kids who didn't respect tradition, of a culture being hijacked in real time. Meanwhile, younger riders walked with confidence, flaunting their Rebels not as cheaper alternatives, but as statements that Harley was no longer the only way to ride with pride. The clashes were not always civil. At some rallies, jeers turned into shouting matches, and in online groups, the divide grew poisonous. Older riders accused Honda owners of being imposters, of diluting the sacred image of the motorcycle brotherhood. But the younger voices pushed back, pointing to Harley's soaring prices and stagnant designs as proof that the company had abandoned them first. For them, riding a Rebel was not betrayal. It was liberation from Harley's monopoly on identity. One young rider explained, "When I rolled into a rally on my Rebel, the looks I got could have cut steel. Some guys muttered about imports ruining the scene. But here's the thing, I bought my bike cash. No loan, no debt. For me, that's real rebellion. I didn't need Harley's approval to ride." The emotional explosion was as important as any financial trend. It showed that loyalty, once Harley's most unshakable advantage, could fracture when people felt ignored or exploited. Honda had not only sold motorcycles, it had created a rebellion within the rebellion. The very culture Harley built was now slipping from its grip, rebranded by outsiders who understood the moment better than the insiders. And the backlash from the riders was only the spark, because far larger forces, political, financial, and global, were about to enter the fight. But if you think the drama ends at the rallies, think again. The real shock is waiting in Washington, where Harley's fight has become a political weapon. The numbers game. The battle between Harley-Davidson and Honda was not only fought on highways and at rallies, it was fought in quarterly reports and investor calls. Honda's Rebel 500 was not just selling, it was selling fast. Dealerships reported wait lists, and industry trackers noted that Honda had gained a double-digit share in categories Harley once dominated without question. Meanwhile, Harley's earnings showed slippage, with units dropping year over year. Investors began whispering the unthinkable, that Harley's dominance in the cruiser segment might be over. What made this sting more than market share was the symbolism of the numbers. For decades, Harley's financial reports were more than just data. They were proof of American resilience. Every bike sold was another declaration that American manufacturing could still command loyalty. But when Honda's numbers began climbing, those same statistics told a darker story, that globalization wasn't coming. It had already won. Honda could produce at scale, move faster, and distribute more widely, while Harley struggled under the weight of its own tradition and cost structures. The numbers revealed something else. Demographic collapse. Harley's average buyer was in their late 40s to early 50s, while Honda was pulling in riders barely in their 20s. The math was merciless. A brand appealing only to aging loyalists could not survive forever. Investors knew it. Honda knew it. And slowly, Harley's own executives had to face it too. But numbers only tell part of the story, because behind those numbers stood workers whose lives were being shaken. Factories under fire. As Honda's Rebel 500 surged in popularity, Harley's factories began to feel the ripple effects. Over time, hours dried up, production slowed, and whispers of layoffs spread through Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. For many workers, this wasn't just about losing a paycheck, it was about losing a legacy. Yet even as anger rose, there were quiet hints of defiance inside Harley's walls. Some engineers whispered about projects still in development. Lighter frames, electric prototypes, even radical redesigns that could shock the market if given the green light. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind loyalists that Harley wasn't dead yet. The question was whether those sparks of innovation would be fanned into a flame or smothered under tradition and cost. Union leaders still called it betrayal, blaming management for chasing luxury margins instead of investing in the everyday rider. But the possibility of a counterstrike hung in the air, a reminder that Harley's story wasn't finished. One factory worker reflected, "I work on the line in Milwaukee. Used to be overtime was steady. We'd crank out bikes nonstop. Now, whole shifts are going quiet. My nephew just got his first motorcycle, and it wasn't a Harley. That hit harder than the slowdown in the factory." And when factories fall silent, politicians are never far behind. Washington weighs in. As Harley began to stumble, politicians on both sides of the aisle seized the moment. For conservatives, Harley's struggles became proof that American companies were being strangled by global competition and overregulation. For progressives, it was a story about corporate greed and mismanagement, about how Harley had priced itself out of the reach of ordinary workers while ignoring affordable innovation. Into this firestorm, Honda's Rebel 500 became more than a motorcycle. It became a symbol in the war over America's economic future. Tariffs, subsidies, and trade wars suddenly entered the conversation. Should the United States government step in to protect Harley? Some lawmakers argued yes, saying Harley was a cultural institution as much as a company. Others scoffed, claiming that no brand, no matter how patriotic, should be shielded from the realities of competition. Meanwhile, lobbyists swarmed Washington, Harley begging for help, Honda insisting it was playing fair. The clash extended beyond the dealerships and factories, straight into Capitol Hill. The drama was not just about economics, it was about identity politics. Harley was invoked at rallies as a stand-in for the real America, while Honda was painted alternately as a threat or as proof that the old America had to change. Each speech, each press release pushed the stakes higher. Harley had always been about freedom, but now freedom itself was being debated in Congress. But the real panic wasn't in Congress. It was on Wall Street, where Harley's collapse sent shockwaves through investors and rivals alike. Wall Street trembles. Investors watched Harley slipping numbers with unease. Once considered a safe American icon, Harley stock began to wobble. Analysts downgraded projections, pointing to Honda's surge as a structural threat, not a passing fad. Hedge funds smelled blood, shorting Harley shares while quietly buying into Honda's expansion. What had once been a proud brand was suddenly a risky bet. The financial press played up the drama. Headlines shouted about Harley's decline, comparing it to once great American automakers that had stumbled in the face of foreign efficiency. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Harley, with its roaring engines and chrome, was being outmaneuvered not by regulators, but by a motorcycle half its price and twice its momentum. Investors who had once draped themselves in Harley's patriotic appeal were now asking a cold question. Could this company survive the decade? The tremors reached beyond Harley itself. Suppliers, dealerships, and even credit firms tied to Harley financing felt the shockwaves. If Harley's sales dropped too far, entire ecosystems could collapse. Meanwhile, Honda's financial muscle reassured investors. It could weather downturns, adjust strategy, and still win. For Wall Street, the choice between a stumbling Harley and a surging Honda was brutally clear. But markets are only one battlefield. The next fight would erupt on the streets, where culture, identity, and politics collided with raw emotion. The streets speak. As Honda's Rebel 500 multiplied across cities, rallies and rideouts took on a new tension. Harley loyalists looked on with suspicion and sometimes outright hostility when rebels rolled into their meetups. The sense of betrayal ran deep. For decades, group rides and rallies were Harley's sacred ground. Spaces where the brand was more than machinery, it was identity. But now, younger riders showed up astride Hondas, and suddenly the old guard felt invaded. In towns from Sturgis to Daytona, confrontations broke out. Some Harley riders heckled the Honda owners, calling them cheap imitators. Others saw the rebels as proof that the new generation had abandoned tradition. But not all voices joined in anger. Some younger Harley owners admitted quietly that the rebels looked sharp, that their friends who couldn't afford Harleys still deserved a way to ride. A generational fracture was opening. On one side, heritage, pride, exclusivity. On the other, affordability, accessibility, momentum. The cultural wound was becoming more visible. It wasn't just about sales anymore. It was about whether Harley still meant rebellion, or whether Honda had stolen the very spirit Harley once claimed to own. And just as the streets grew louder, the media amplified those voices. Media frenzy. News outlets pounced on the cultural clash between Honda and Harley, spinning it into stories that blurred economics and identity. Headlines in motorcycle magazines compared the Rebel 500's sleek lines to Harley's outdated bulk. Business channels turned quarterly losses into cautionary tales. Even lifestyle outlets ran pieces declaring the Rebel the bike of a generation. Talk shows invited union leaders and politicians to debate what the rise of Honda meant for American jobs. Riders themselves appeared on air, some proudly defending Harley, others gushing about the affordability and simplicity of the Rebel. Social media turned the conflict into memes and hashtags. Videos comparing Harley's price tags to Honda's value for money went viral. Every clip, every tweet, every headline chipped away at Harley's mythos. The narrative was shifting. Once Harley dominated the cultural imagination. Now Honda's Rebel wasn't just a motorcycle, it was a movement. By the time mainstream late-night comedians began making Harley jokes, it was clear Harley had lost the narrative war, at least for the moment. But while the media painted pictures, the real battle was unfolding on a much larger stage. The global one. Global reverberations. Honda's triumph over Harley began resonating far beyond U.S. highways. In Europe, where younger riders were already flocking to practical, affordable bikes, the Rebel 500 became a runaway success. In Asia, the bike exploded in popularity, cementing Honda as the dominant force for the next generation of riders. Meanwhile, Harley's attempts to expand abroad faltered, with their big cruisers seen as overpriced luxuries rather than cultural icons. The consequences were stark. Honda wasn't just eating Harley's lunch in the American market, it was setting the tone for global two-wheeled culture. The Rebel became shorthand for practicality, modernity, and youth. Harley, by contrast, was increasingly seen as a nostalgic relic, appealing only to aging baby boomers and collectors. In countries like India, Thailand, and Brazil, the Rebel opened doors for millions of first-time riders who might never have considered a Harley. For Harley, the global humiliation was worse than the local battle. If America was their home, the world had become their mirror. And the reflection showed an uncomfortable truth. Harley was out of step with the times. And if that wasn't bad enough, the brands themselves began weaponizing the war. Brand war. Marketing campaigns turned sharper. Harley doubled down on its heritage, plastering ads with slogans about freedom, American pride, and brotherhood. But the more they leaned on nostalgia, the older they looked. Honda, meanwhile, played it differently. Their ads showed young riders in cities, commuting, laughing, exploring, casting the Rebel 500 not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a tool of everyday liberation. The contrast was brutal. Harley's ads looked like sepia-toned postcards. Honda's felt like TikToks. For the youth, the choice was obvious. And then Honda escalated. They began directly comparing prices, running subtle campaigns that highlighted how a Rebel could be bought for nearly half the cost of Harley's smallest cruiser. They didn't say Harley by name, but everyone knew who they meant. Brand loyalty turned into brand warfare. Harley dealerships hosted loyalty events to rally support, while Honda stores hosted open ride days with long lines of eager first-time buyers. It wasn't subtle. It was a duel for the soul of motorcycling, and each passing month Honda's side of the story seemed fresher, more accessible, more alive. But Harley wasn't finished. Because when a brand is cornered, the counterattack often surprises everyone. Washington responds. Harley's fall wasn't just a business story, it was a political earthquake. In Washington, lawmakers who once posed proudly beside Harley bikes during campaign stops suddenly faced uncomfortable questions. How could America's most iconic motorcycle lose ground so quickly to a Japanese rival? The answers weren't flattering. Some blamed trade policy, arguing tariffs had made Harley's parts more expensive, while Honda leveraged global supply chains. Others pointed fingers at Harley itself, calling it a victim of arrogance, refusing to innovate while foreign competitors raced ahead. For politicians, the optics were brutal. Harley had been a symbol of American industrial grit, frequently paraded as proof that U.S. manufacturing still mattered. Now, the sight of thousands of young riders on Hondas made that narrative collapse. Campaign ads featuring Harleys suddenly looked outdated, even desperate. A few opportunistic candidates tried to weaponize the crisis, framing it as a betrayal by globalization, warning that if Harley could fall, any American company could be next. The debate spilled into hearings, think tank panels, and policy memos. Harley's downfall became a talking point not just about motorcycles, but about the fragility of American industry in a globalized economy. And while Washington argued, workers on the ground felt the impact in real time. The unions fight back. In Milwaukee, York, and Kansas City, where Harley plants once roared with assembly line energy, the slowdown hit hard. Overtime dried up. Layoffs loomed. Workers who had built bikes for decades watched as their livelihoods became bargaining chips in a global fight they hadn't asked for. Unions reacted with fury. Leaders blasted Harley's executives for mismanaging the brand, focusing on Wall Street dividends while ignoring the everyday consumer. They staged demonstrations, waving signs that didn't just call for job protection, but accused management of betrayal. Some rallies even featured symbolic gestures, workers setting up a Rebel 500 next to a Harley Cruiser to prove how badly leadership had misread the market. The anger resonated beyond motorcycle plants. Other unions, from steel to auto, saw Harley as a cautionary tale, a company that clung to its past until the future ran it over. Calls for stronger protections and more aggressive industrial policy grew louder. The Harley crisis was no longer just about motorcycles. It was about the American workers' fight to stay relevant in a rapidly changing economy. And just as unions raised their fists, the consumer made their voice heard in another way, by voting with their wallets. If you're fascinated by these industry shakeups and cultural battles, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter in this story. Consumers choose sides. Across dealerships, the divide between brand loyalty and economic reality became impossible to ignore. Families who once dreamed of Harleys now found themselves drawn to the Rebel's practicality. A new rider could step into the culture for less than half the price of a Harley. For households squeezed by inflation, the choice wasn't ideological. It was survival. The psychology cut deep. Buying a Harley had once meant buying into American pride, a ritual of identity. But for many, pride had a price tag they could no longer afford. Honda's move democratized motorcycling, making ownership possible for thousands who would never have considered a Harley. Some celebrated this as progress, proof that freedom on two wheels didn't have to come with a luxury cost. Others mourned it as the cheapening of a sacred tradition. Dealership anecdotes told the story best. Parents who grew up around Harleys quietly encouraged their children to start with Hondas. College students pooled savings to buy Rebels as first bikes. Even middle-aged riders priced out of Harley upgrades opted for Honda as a practical alternative. The consumer tide had turned, not with noise, but with steady, unstoppable momentum. A factory worker reflected, "I work on the line in Milwaukee. Used to be overtime was steady. We'd crank out bikes nonstop. Now whole shifts are going quiet. My nephew just got his first motorcycle and it wasn't a Harley. That hit harder than the slowdown in the factory, and the ripples of that momentum began to reshape markets far beyond motorcycles. The global shockwave. What started as a motorcycle rivalry became a symbol of shifting global power. Honda's victory wasn't confined to American streets. It sent shockwaves through the international economy. Investors saw the shift as proof that Japanese manufacturers still had the agility to outmaneuver U.S. giants. Stock markets responded. Honda shares climbed. Harley slumped. Analysts declared it a case study in how legacy brands could be dismantled when they stopped listening to consumers. Other industries took note. Automakers, tech companies, even fashion brands studied the battle, seeing it as a warning that nostalgia couldn't protect profits forever. Global supply chains recalibrated, with Asian manufacturing hubs gaining prestige while American plants fought to justify their costs. Even geopolitics stirred. Trade negotiators in Europe and Asia used Harley's decline as leverage, arguing that America's industrial dominance was slipping. Diplomats whispered that if Harley, the motorcycle equivalent of apple pie, could stumble, then no U.S. brand was untouchable. The battle between Harley-Davidson and Honda isn't just about motorcycles, it's about culture, loyalty, and the future of freedom on two wheels. Whether you side with tradition or embrace the new wave, one thing's for sure, this fight is far from over. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Honda's Rebel 500 could really dethrone Harley, or will Harley make a comeback? If you enjoyed this breakdown, drop a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next big story shaking up the motorcycle world.